Today's lecture is a brief introduction on masculinity studies. But before we understand what masculinity is, it must be quite clear that it is a part of the sociology of gender. Gender entered the sociological lexicon around the 1970s and immediately became one of the key categories of scholarly interest and introspection. The categories of male and female were being discussed by sociologists since its very inception. But the discovery that sex roles in society that were being discussed could be socially constructed and not given categories, and that an alternative was possible, was introduced when empirical studies extended beyond Europe and North America. Sociology was an inherently male-centric discipline, produced from an unquestioned male standpoint. In the 1950s, for example, when Talcott Parsons extended Emily Durkheim's functionalist perspective on the family and talked about the division of labor within the family, he talked about the sex roles, what the husband should do and what the wife should do. And he was quite clear that these roles were to be kept separate to maintain balance and order in society. Now, an uncritical analysis extends the binaries of modern versus traditional or organic versus mechanical societies to the roles performed by men and women. A functionalist perspective of the world necessitated a desperate attempt at maintaining balance and order in societies. And this balance could only be maintained if everyone did their own part of the work and did not go beyond it. Now, men were perceived as rational, calculative, instrumental, whereas women were the binary opposites. They were more affective, they were more emotional, and at times irrational beings. The Marxist approach was equally sexist. Its emancipatory zeal was not extended to women. Women, in Marxist perception, were responsible for the reproduction of the labor force, both biologically and emotionally, and therefore they were relegated to the private sphere. And this was made possible through the imagination of history as one that posed early men as strong and women as passive. Feminist approaches in the social sciences delineated the categories of sex and gender. This was the beginning of gender studies, that sex and gender were two separate constructs. While sex was a biological construct, gender was a social construct. Now, why do we call them construct? Because they can be altered. Today, we even call sex a biological construct because it is possible through medical intervention, thankfully, to alter one's sex if one does not identify that particular sex with the correlative gender. Anne Oakley, who was one of the first people to define or differentiate sex and gender, writes that sex refers to the biological division into male and female, and gender to the parallel and socially unequal division into femininity and masculinity. Now, here there are certain categories and certain complications that we would be introducing in order to understand this further. Male or female. The binary of male and female is a biological category, whereas the binary of masculine and feminine, like we said, is a social category or a sociological category. It is hierarchical. There are certain aspects of masculinity and certain aspects of femininity that differ from each other. Now, when a biological male performs masculinity, he becomes a man. Vice versa, when a biological female performs femininity, she becomes a woman. Now, we are complicating this further so that we can untangle it in the course of this lecture, and you may be able to understand why we keep calling them social constructs and categories. Now, one important continuity that we have had since a very long time in social sciences is the hierarchical structure or relationship between men and women. It has persisted despite many other changes in the meaning of femininity and masculinity, and in the social activities of women and men. They have differed. The conception of femininity and masculinity may have differed, but the hierarchical nature has not. Gender as a social construct may be studied as a sociological category because it is hierarchical, because it refers not only to individual identity and personality, but also at the symbolic level to cultural ideas and stereotypes of what masculinity and femininity is. At the structural level, the sexual division of labor in institutions and organizations affect how society operates. The complexity of the terms inherent in the understanding of sex and gender is extremely necessary to understand before we venture into the next step in understanding how masculinity affects the behavior of not only men but also women in societies and how they perform their gender. How do these binaries work? Gender has a certain performative aspect. Gender requires a certain kind of performance, and it can be understood through the binaries of being man and woman. These terms lie at the intersection of the other two, which is masculinity and male, femininity and female. Right? Now, what are the binaries? If you imagine how a man should behave and how a woman should behave, we can actually go back to our school textbooks where you used to have questions such as state 5 things that your father does and state 5 things that your mother does. Right? And we would have very specific answers where the father goes to the office, and the father watches television, while the mother cooks and the mother cleans and the mother takes care of you. In recent times, when there are more women in the public sphere, the category of the multitasker woman is also very popular, where a woman not only manages the office but also comes back and does a double shift at home. So these binaries are extremely prevalent, and feminists were talking about it, feminists were concerned about it. So why were men bothered? From where did masculinity studies emerge? So we will now talk about the origin of masculinity studies. Now, it was not until the second wave of feminism started gaining momentum in the 1970s, late 70s, that men felt the need to question their legitimacy and power in society. Feminist studies were primarily aimed at considering women's experiences, women's narratives, which had been discounted from academic scholarship for a very long time. As feminists started questioning the patriarchal structure of society, studies extended beyond the victims of patriarchy to the perpetrators. Men's studies emerged as a reaction to their privilege, to their dominance being questioned. With the gains of liberal feminism and increasing women's visibility in the economic and public life, men and male identity faced a crisis situation. As women's economic participation increased, the struggle of women for gender equality in a patriarchal world was perceived as a success of women over men. Men were losing their good provider role and the traditional status that they had in society. This movement, the men's rights movement, which still has a few followers, is anti-feminist, but it is a non-political movement, and it argues that men are victimized as a result of the gains of the feminist movements. But the 1990s actually witnessed a major shift in masculinity studies, especially with the onset of the queer approach, with queer studies coming in. Rather than judging men as perpetrators of patriarchy, it was suggested that men were also victims of patriarchy. During the last few decades, masculinity studies have extended their empirical and theoretical understanding, and they now focus on the diversities of masculinities across the world, and they discuss how manhood can only be defined through an intersectional approach, because being male is not the only identity that prevails in society. There are other identities that intersect with manhood, such as caste, class, sexuality, race. The concern over masculinity and the impact of these gendered standards in society and what the expectations of masculinity does to men, how is it impacting the young boys in the society. These concerns gained momentum after the Me Too movement, which you might be familiar with, when a lot of women in various sectors started coming out and started talking about the physical abuse that they have been, sexual abuse, mental abuse, physical abuse that they have been facing in their workspaces specifically. So some men claimed that it was a witch hunt to abuse and stigmatize men, while there were certain pro-feminist arguments that questioned not men but the toxicity of masculinity traits in society. Although we are constantly talking about how masculinity studies emerged in the 1970s and the 1980s and how we started talking about gender much later, we must give credit where it's due. Although most of them were quite sexist in nature, the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud, of Lacan, and of Carl Jung are something that we need to discuss very briefly in order to establish that psychoanalytic theories had already started talking about this mental division. Being male or being female was not entirely biological, but also psychological. Let's start with Sigmund Freud. In the early 1900s, Freud claimed that adult sexuality and gender were not fixed by nature, but were constructed through a long and conflict-ridden process. Freud describes the formative moment of masculinity through his analogy of the Oedipal complex, whereby young boys have a desire for their mother and jealousy and hatred for their father. And Freud claimed that men had a pre-Oedipal narcissistic masculinity that underpinned what he calls castration anxiety, that led men to project themselves in a particular way, where they constantly needed to prove to themselves that they were men and they had not transposed into a female. A very similar line has been taken by Lacan, who talks about masculinity very similarly, where he says that masculinity involves the pretense of having the phallus, while femininity involves the masquerade of being the phallus. So there is a very phallocentric approach where everyone is running after one anatomical organ, and they are definitely sexist in nature and a little complicated. We'll not get into it, but just to introduce the concept to you. Then comes Carl Jung. Now, Carl Jung's theory was more elaborate, but also misogynist in certain cases. Carl Gustav Jung's research on the masculine and the feminine purported them as archetypes. He said that these are archetypes rather than constitutional categories. Archetypes are universal, inborn models of people, behaviors, and personalities that play a role in influencing human behavior. Young claims that we inherit these archetypes in a similar way that we inherit other things from our parents, society, neighbors, ancestors, friends. Now, one of his 4 archetypes is the anima animus. Now, anima represents the feminine qualities, while animus represents the male qualities. Now, he believes that every individual, whether male or female, has both anima and animus, okay, has both masculine and feminine traits. And it is, in fact, through a certain repressive society that only one aspect comes out and the other is repressed. Feminine energy is often defined as indirect, it is receptive, it is related to passivity, it is related to irrationality, but it is also related to emotions. And Jung really does not claim that it should be kept separate. He says that it actually does not lead to a proper psychological development of the child if the anima or the animus in either cases are repressed. Now, these theories were there in society, but they were not really challenging the hierarchies of gender. They were simply mentioning it. The first challenge to this hierarchical nature, and a challenge through scholarly introspection, came with Raven Connell. Now, the key theory on masculinity that is still really used was provided by Connell in her book Masculinities. It was based on her idea of masculinities was based on Gramsci's theory on hegemony, okay? A condition in which a fundamental class exercises a political, intellectual, and moral role of leadership within a hegemonic system cemented by a common worldview or organic ideology. She calls the superiority of masculinity in society as hegemonic masculinity. She defines it as the configuration of gender practice which embodies the currently accepted answer to the problem of legitimacy of patriarchy, which guarantees the dominant position of men and the subordination of women. Connell clarified that studying men was important because they were a part of the problem of patriarchy, and it was impossible to challenge these existing structures if men were not co-opted as also a part of the solution. Now, men's studies and masculinity studies is fairly new, it's extremely modern. So, Connell claimed that there were mainly 4 approaches that were taken to understand masculinity studies, and she rejects all of them. The first one is an essentialist definition. The essentialist definition designates what masculinity means through one feature. So, it focuses on one core feature and all other features revolve around it. Freud's and Lacan's phallocentric approach that we discussed before can be a good example of this. Secondly, it was a normative definition. Now, normative definition of masculinity may be given which uses different stereotypes to discuss masculinities. A normative definition would provide the ideal typical male that one should aspire to become. The positivist definition describes masculinity as what men do and femininity as what women do. It is more empirical than the other two, but this approach has inherent assumptions on the differentiated roles of men and women. Lastly, there is a semantic definition which is symbolic in nature, which claims that there are symbolic differences in society, symbolic differences between men and women. Now, masculinity is everything that is not feminine. Cornell says that this is, although the most coherent approach, it lacks an understanding of the intersectional complications and complexities that govern the way diverse masculinities are constructed. Now, masculinity, to the extent that the term can be briefly defined at all, is simultaneously a place in gender relations, the practices through which men and women engage that place in gender, and the effects of these practices in bodily experience, personality, and culture. Now, Cornell does not limit the definition of masculinities to the negation of femininity. And she creates a theory of gender order where she talks about gender regimes. She says that this gender order is maintained in society through specific gender regimes. Now, if you look at the image that is there in front of you, this is the state. The state, this is from a global summit, this particular picture. If you look at the composition of the picture, you would see there is one female member. And it is quite clear how gender regimes are maintained, who is making the laws, who is creating the rules. If you look at magazine covers, capitalism, what does capitalism want to sell? Capitalism wants to sell gender and differentiated gender. It sells particular items to men and particular items to women. So if you also look at the magazine cover, which is in front of you, if you look at how LeBron is dressed and how the female is dressed, dressing for every shape from size 0 to 16. So it is a size 0 woman is quite visible, which is being sold in the market. According to Cornell, she says that all of these gender regimes help to create different kinds of structures in society. Gendered work, gendered structures, gendered organizations. If you look at gendered work, you would find that there is a pay gap between men and women in society for the same kinds of work that they do. We have often, in sociology of gender, you must have heard about the glass ceiling, where women cannot achieve positions of power, or where there is a double shift where women cannot go beyond a certain time at the workspace because they have to go back home and perform the domestic duties. Now, we keep talking about women here, but what about the man who is now the sole breadwinner of the family, who now has the expectation to be instrumental, calculative, responsible, who has to take everything on his shoulders and also has to be infantilized by the women in his life? Now, Cornell looks at all of this and she creates 4 archetypes of masculinity. She says that in society, there are 4 specific types that are imagined. First is, of course, the hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity is the accepted type. It is dominant over all others. It is the kind of masculinity that would generally try to legitimize patriarchy, the dominance of men over women, the standard to which all men are supposed to rise to, aspire to, right? And it is primarily based on heterosexuality, on marriage, and paid work. Of course, physical toughness is a given. If you look at the kind of men who are typified as perfect men, especially in media, you would realize that there is a certain violence, certain aggression that comes with being that perfect man, the one who saves the damsel in distress. Now, the second type of masculinity is complicit masculinity. Complicit men accept and participate in the hegemonic system to benefit from its advantages, right? And they want to prevent subordination. Now, what happens? It is in the middle of the complicit masculinity is in the middle of hegemonic and subordinate masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity cannot be practiced by all men, but it benefits all men. So, complicit masculinity, in a way, benefits from hegemonic masculinity, yet these men can only aspire, or this kind of masculinity, because really it has got nothing to do with men, this kind of masculinity aspires for hegemonic masculinity. The third kind, the third archetype, let's say, is subordinated masculinities. Okay? Images of which can be seen through the gay men are portrayed in media images. The society considers them as lesser men who are unable to achieve the dictated masculine standards of the society. And the last category that Cornell talks about is marginalized masculinities. Marginalized masculinities, although they share heterosexuality with the hegemonic men, they are not as subordinated, but they are in a disadvantaged position because of their race, because of their class, ethnicity, disability, etc. Scholars such as Mrinalini Sinha has written a lot about the colonial masculinities and how colonialism has also shaped the way in which men in post-colonial nations behave, and how even the conception of nation and nationhood is based on masculinity, where it is the sons of the soil who are saving their mother country. You know, this motherization, this personification of the territory of the country as mother that needs to be protected, as female that the sons of the soil would protect, is a part of this narrative of masculinity. So, how to be a man? You have to perform to become a man, right? Masculinities are extremely precarious. Masculinity needs to be continuously performed, otherwise you can very easily lose it. So there is a constant threat in men that they may be perceived as lesser male, or worse still, gay, right? This is called homohysteria. Anderson developed the inclusive masculinity theory to understand the changing relationships between young men and their masculinities, and how homophobia shapes and constructs, regulates masculinities in settings. Okay? Hegemonic masculinities are shaped in extremely violent ways, extremely toxic ways, to differentiate the cisgendered heterosexual man from the subordinate homosexual man. So, unless you are performing manhood, womanhood is not that difficult to perform, or I would say womanhood is not that difficult to lose, but you can lose manhood very easily. Now, with time, with more interest in masculinity studies, there are different kinds of masculinities that are being discussed today. So we'll just go through it very, very briefly on the kinds of masculinities that are being, the new kinds that are being discussed today, and conclude with that. So hybrid masculinities. Hybrid masculinities refers to men's selective incorporation of performances and identity elements associated with marginalized, subordinated masculinities and femininities. So men take certain aspects of masculinity, take certain aspects of femininity, and behave in a way that they want to behave. Then comes female masculinities. Now, this kind of masculinity is very exciting because it tries to understand masculinity without men. It looks at the way masculinity is performed by butch women within lesbian communities, and it explores issues of transsexuality among transgender dykes. Female masculinity is not a bad imitation of virility. Okay? There is a dramatic staging of hybridity and minority genders that is performed through female masculinities. You have something called business masculinities. It is related to the category of hegemonic masculinities and how men behave in their workspace as bosses, etc. You have medicalized masculinities. This is related to capitalism. In what are you selling to the men for them to become men? So you're selling prevention of baldness, steroids for bodybuilding, etc. So you are medicalizing manhood and medicalizing masculinities gradually. There are other kinds, which is metrosexual masculinity, men who dress well; chameleon masculinity, which is the creating a soldier, a citizen soldier, etc. And you can think of Captain America as a very good example of this. We also talk about ecological masculinity, which talks about, I think it is interesting because it talks about bringing men closer to nature, and not taking them far away from nature, which had happened at a point of time that women are more natural, men are more cultural and rational. So it is necessary to bring men closer to nature so they too have an ecological duty to prevent climate change, etc. It's also a very exciting sector. Now, in conclusion, really, masculinities, femininities are identities that both men and women have to negotiate in their everyday lives. Being masculine has got absolutely nothing to do with being male. So, a deeper understanding and more awareness of how men's role in society is gendered and it is socially constructed may not only aid in curbing patriarchy and making women's lives better, but also allow men to live freely beyond the socially conscriptive prescriptions and allow men to live freely and allow society become probably a better place to live in. Thank you.